Hey everyone, this is a piece by Marcel Stoetzler. It's titled Postone's Marx, a Theorist of Modern Society, Its Social Movements and Its Imprisonment by Abstract Labor. In the first section of this essay, I will outline some of the basic arguments of Moïse Postone's book Time, Labor, and Social Domination, focusing on the pivotal concepts abstract labor, class value, and time. Footnote. This essay owes a lot to comments by Lars Stubbe, Hamburg, and Christina Achinger, Nottingham, on earlier drafts and the latter's unpublished presentation on Postone, Achinger, 1999. I have pieces by Christina Achinger on the channel. They're about anti-Semitism. But there might only be one. Anyway, end footnote. After outlining abstract labor, the most basic category in Postone's conception, I will explore Postone's concept of class. The discussion of the concept of value refers back to that of abstract labor. The concept of time will take the most of this section because time seems to me to be Postone's most original contribution. Its implications for the concept of history are pivotal to what I will develop in the third part of this essay. In the second section, I will contrast the presentation of Postone's conception with a discussion of some of the criticisms raised by reviewers of the book. In the third part, I will explore the relevance of the concepts of time and history for understanding the historical dynamics specific to modern bourgeois society and the logic of social movements in this society. I need some water. I get laughed at a lot in school because my water bottle's so loud. Hopefully you could hear that and get a nice sample of, and you can imagine what that sounds like in a silent classroom. Moïse Postone's reading of abstract labor, class value, and time. Mediation by abstract labor as the, quote, social mediation in capitalism is the focal point of Postone's, quote, reinterpretation of Marx's critical theory, end quote. Postone states that Marx's theory of capitalism is a critical theory of the nature of modernity itself, namely of modern society as a directionally dynamic society based on a unique social form of social mediation that is abstract and impersonal. It aims to show that labor in capitalist society plays a historically unique role in mediating social relations. The real abstraction of life under capital is also the source of the typically modern intellectual reflections of abstraction. Quote, the peculiar nature of social mediation in capitalism gives rise to an antinomy, so characteristic of modern Western worldviews, between a, quote, secularized, quote, thingly concrete dimension and a purely abstract dimension, whereby the socially constituted character of both dimensions, as well as their intrinsic relation, is veiled, end quote. In Commodity Determining Society, the same labor appears twice, as concrete useful labor and as abstract value-creating labor. Footnote. All the following is, of course, based on the concept of the commodity form in Marx's Capital, Chapter 1. End footnote. Abstract human labor is considered the, quote, social substance common to all particular forms of productive activity. This overall commonality appears to be the, quote, expenditure of human energy in any physiological form, end quote. That is, a transhistorical physiological residue, but as Marx stresses, the objectivity of values is, quote, purely social, being the core structure of a historically specific social formation, that of the capitalist mode of production. Abstract labor is not a transhistorical substance, but a historically and socially determined one. The statement that in any society humans interact with nature is a truism of little explanatory power. The point is how interaction constitutes society. Quote, labor as such does not constitute society per se. Labor in capitalism, however, does constitute that society, end quote. Postone. Concrete labor is understood hereby as an intentional activity that transforms material in a determinate fashion. Abstract labor is the function of such labors as socially mediating activities, as specific to the capitalist mode of production, a mediation based on the assumed commensurability of all labor activities. Footnote. Commensurability, the ability of two quantities to be measured by the same scale, implies that they are of the same abstract essence, value. Without the assumption of this essential identity, different products could not be exchanged as equivalents of equal value. End footnote. In non-capitalist societies, laboring activities are social by virtue of the matrix of personal, qualitatively particular social relations in which those laboring activities are embedded. Exploitation and domination are extrinsic to non-capitalist forms of labor, such as serf labor, while exploitation and domination are integral to commodity-determined labor. In traditional social formations such as feudalism, labor is bonded or, quote, fettered, as protagonists and apologists of bourgeois revolutions complained. In the capitalist mode of production, as opposed to that abstract labor, is the bond. Abstract labor performs objective constraints that are, quote, apparently non-social. End quote. Quote, the working class, is the necessary basis of the present society under which the working class suffers, end quote. Postone bases his discussion on the concept of class, on the example for class struggle given by Marx in the first volume of Capital, the limitation of the working day, being the legal result of class struggle based on the constitution of the workers as a collective force. It, quote, set the stage, historically, for the replacement of the production of absolute by relative surplus value and formal by real subsumption. Since the replacement there's no quote there, sorry. Since this replacement keeps repeating itself, quote, ongoing conflicts, end quote, about the rate of exploitation are, quote, intrinsic aspects of everyday life in capitalist society, end quote. In this sense, class conflict is, quote, a driving element, end quote, of the historical development of capitalism, which includes its totalization as well as those moments that facilitate capitalism's abolition. Quote, class is a relational category. A class is a class only in relation to other classes. Classes, as they occur in the first volume of Capital, quote, are not discrete entities, but structurings of social practice and consciousness, organized antagonistically, end quote. Postone. According to Postone, Marx's argument does not imply that other social strata or groupings, religion, ethnicity, nationality, or gender, play no important roles historically and politically. The category of class, so Postone claims, must not be subjected to, quote, sociological reduction, end quote. That is, the category of class must not be reduced in the manner of conventional sociology to concrete, quote, positive classes as social strata. I think I've heard Stoetzler elsewhere, but I think I don't know if it was him, but maybe it was someone else. But there's kind of like a level of concrete difference, or not concrete difference, the word, level of abstract specificity that's just different between the concepts of, say, proletariat and working class. Like, working class has a little bit of a more, like, empirical flavor to it than proletariat, which is a little bit more abstract. Some people might debate that, but I think that's actually kind of a pretty interesting distinction to be made. In the latter sense, the manner of conventional sociology to reduce the category of class to concrete, quote, positive classes as social strata. Class belongs to the overt, concrete, direct social relations, quote, such as kinship relations or relations of personal or direct domination, end quote. Capitalist society, however, is characteristically structured by a social interrelatedness that cannot be explained in such terms. This is an abstract and a concrete side to, quote, class, in the same way as there is to, quote, commodity. Marx does not relate ideas to the social, quote, situatedness of the social actors in the same sense as a Mannheimian, quote, sociology of knowledge, but Marx relates the ideas themselves to class positioning. For example, in the 18th Brumaire, Marx argues that the thought of the petty bourgeois party presupposes, quote, a world of free and equal commodity producers and owners, end quote. Quote, a world in which all are petty bourgeois, end quote. This does not imply that such a world is a reality for the people who hold this ideology. The, quote, proletarian position, end quote, was the demand for the, quote, social republic. The same persons who held the proletarian position took petty bourgeois, quote, artisanal positions after their defeat. The small peasants, for example, do not form a class at all in the 18th Brumaire. The small peasants, merely local interconnection and, quote, mode of life, interest, and their culture, end quote, might be termed, quote, stratum, but not class, as the category, quote, small peasant is not a structuring element of the social totality. Postone underlines that, quote, while class analysis remains basic to the Marxian critical project, end quote, the concept of class needs to be developed closely from the more basic categories, commodity and value. In turn, the, quote, analysis of value, surplus value, and capital as social forms cannot be fully grasped in terms of class categories, end quote. Whenever class is not rigorously developed in this way, it runs the risk of, quote, a serious sociological reduction of the Marxian critique, end quote. Postone's brief remarks on this issue can be supported by reference to other authors such as George Comnenel. George Comnenel was a Marxist historian, and I need to actually read some of his work because he seems dope in terms of like a lot of his commentary. George Comnenel is really influential for like the kind of like work, like if you're familiar with like Charlie Post or Spencer Dimmock. What the hell's the guy's name whose channel I have on? Andrew Zmolik and people like that. If you listen to any of those chapters, which I never finished Zmolik's book, I just got so fucking busy with school. I really didn't need to finish it about the Industrial Revolution. Comnenel is a very important figure in trying to construct a Marxist framework for conducting historical sociology, which is a little more concrete and empirical than the higher level of theory that a lot of Marxists are operating at, which is still necessary, of course, but it's a little more How do we use this conceptual apparatus? What are the limits of it when applying them to concrete historical developments in kind of like not the micro scale, but maybe like the meso scale of like, how did capitalism develop in this specifically in, I don't know, France? It might be meso level of history. I don't know. It's not the highest level of abstraction you could go to. It's not the most micro level of abstraction you could go to. The most like concrete, specific, empirical, detailed, oriented commentary. But anyway, let me repeat that. Comnenel describes two central elements of bourgeois liberal thought: the notion of progress in historical stages and a concept of class struggle based on a concept of class which Marx subsequently abandoned. The French, quote, Restoration historians Thierry and Mignet developed a bourgeois theory of class struggle drawing on Machiavelli and Hobbes that knew two essential classes in the context of the French Revolution, quote, the idle and decadent descendants of the feudal order of Germanic conquerors, and the productive, innovative, and virtuously, quote, active elements who sprang from the indigenous people, end quote. Class, in this conception, was based on rank, privilege, and political position, as well as on how one secured one's living, which still today are the most widespread determinations of class in the context of sociology. Progress in this conception consists in the triumph of the active and creative element of society, the third estate that is supposed to become the totality of productive society, a la nation. Allowing the active a free hand, quote, liberty, equality, property, and Bentham, end quote, in Marx's ingenious formula from Capital. Yeah, that passage that he's speaking of about the difference between the formal equality of simple circulation and the social relations that take place in production under capitalism. That kind of like is like kind of ironic characterization of that dynamic in Capital, I would agree, is ingenious and brilliant. It's one of my favorite pieces of reading anything. Allowing the active a free hand, quote, liberty, equality, property, and Bentham, end quote, in Marx's ingenious formula from Capital, results in progress and harmony as described by the science of political economy. The realization of commercial or, quote, civil society means the end of history and of class struggle. Important elements of this bourgeois line of thinking underline the ideologies of working class movements, too. Comnenel suggests that Marx himself, quote, seriously underestimated the originality of his own method of social analysis, end quote, and reproduced at times against himself liberal conceptions, in particular in the German ideology. A closer discussion of this trajectory would show that the liberal ideology of sailing with the infallible winds of progress, the productive classes outdoing the idle classes, is being perpetuated in the hegemonic forms of Marxism. In Postone's terms, quote, traditional Marxism, or more specifically, quote, standpoints of labor, end quote, theory. Quote, standpoint of labor, end quote, theory. Footnote. The background for this argument, I haven't read it yet actually, this insight which is implied in Postone's analysis is a crucial contribution to explaining some discriminatory practices and ideologies within the labor movement, such as socialist anti-Semitism. Footnote. The background for this argument was developed by Horkheimer in his 1930 essay, quote, Beginnings of the Bourgeois Philosophy of History, end quote. Postone, who is right to be dismissive of many of Horkheimer's positions, tends to overlook the strengths of some of Horkheimer's early writings. End footnote. Second footnote. Compare with Postone 1986. Postone's analysis implies that at the core of anti-Semitism lies the fetishization of productive as against unproductive capital. The anti-Semites imagine themselves as the collective of honest, hard-working producers, the Jews as non-productive parasites who manage to appropriate surplus by domination of the spheres of circulation and mediation in its various modes. The anti-Semitic projection obscures that the specifically capitalist exploitation is being done in the sphere of production. This crucial aspect of modern anti-Semitism was indeed first fully developed in the context of what Marx attacked as, quote, utopian, i.e. petty bourgeois forms of socialism. Adorno and Horkheimer described in Dialectic of Enlightenment that, quote, bourgeois anti-Semitism has a specific economic foundation, the concealment of domination in production, end quote. Horkheimer. End footnote. The latter arise whenever and to the extent that the labor movement is not a proletarian movement. The claim to be speaking, quote, from the standpoint of labor can be understood in this perspective as an element of bourgeois ideology that is incompatible with Marx's critique of political economy, whether or not Marx himself occasionally might have formulated such a claim. The dichotomy of material wealth and abstract value is rooted in the double character of labor in the capitalist mode of production as abstract and concrete labor. The productivity of labor is based on the social character of labor as productive activity, concrete labor. It is nothing other than historically developed forms of social organization and social knowledge. Value, though, is based on the opposite dimension of capitalist labor. Value is the objectification of labor as socially mediating activity, abstract labor. This means that value, on the one hand, does not directly reflect productivity and the production of material wealth, whereas wealth, on the other hand, is not exclusively and not even necessarily bound to the expenditure of human labor. This implies that a society based on the measurement of value, the society of capital, will never be able to radically and globally reduce the expenditure of, quote, brains, hands, muscles, nerves, end quote, even if the society would potentially be able to do so and let forces of nature and machines do all or most of the work. Footnote. Machines as such increase wealth but not value. As a machine, as such, reduces the production of value in that the machine replaces living labor. A capitalist enterprise will only implement that machine if it is instrumental to the overall strategy of increasing value, that is, increasing exploitation. One can expect that within the framework of the capitalist mode of production, only such machines will be developed and implemented that increase exploitation. No small wealth can be produced beyond what is valuable. It seems to me that it's important to say, this is just a side note from myself, it seems to me important to say that the introduction of machines, also the choice of introduction of machines, will be to shed labor as well, and thus perhaps increase the exploitation of those still employed, but also shedding human beings from the production process, and despite countering influences, will create a very serious problem of redundant labor and thus redundant human beings. And the machine also doesn't really reduce the amount of value that's being produced until it becomes common, right? So if you are a capitalist who has a special machine that other capitalists do not have or have yet to have access to, you are still appropriating the same amount of value through your commodity sales, even though you are expending less less value represented in money in the production of those same commodities. Yeah, there's this idea, and I think it's like it's a complicated thing because on the one hand, individual value doesn't exist, right? Value is like a social relation between human beings that is facilitated through things. But the concept of individual value, I think, is actually really helpful because it explains, even though it's not actually real, it's referring to, but it does help. It is helpful in a way when you say like the individual value of a commodity. Say the commodity produced in plant A has a different level of monetarily represented value than the going standard. So I think that the notion of individual value, even though socially not the case, because value is dictated by socially necessary labor, not particular socially necessary labor, understanding the distinction between particular particular labors being applied to production versus and competing against this kind of like social average of necessary labor, the concept of individual value is very helpful. But maybe that's just confusing you. I don't know. I'm just talking. I'm thinking out loud. Sorry, these are just notes on the side of the... Visualize everything that I say as notes on the side of a page that you wish weren't there. Anyway. Where am I? This society condemns itself to never-ending drudgery. Quote, with advanced technological production, bracket the, end bracket, expenditure of direct human labor time no longer stands in any meaningful relationship to the production of bracket material, end bracket, wealth. End quote. Postone. This is, according to Postone, the fundamental contradiction of the capitalist mode of production. The value form as a core structure of society becomes increasingly anachronistic. Material wealth becomes more and more independent from direct expenditure of labor. Productivity historically accumulated human knowledge and experience. The world, the afterlife of thousands of past generations, works increasingly for the living and could, for the first time in history, free them from most of the drudgery. Only the capitalist mode of production bases the capitalist mode of production is on the measurement of riches, not as material wealth, but in the form of abstract value, materialized in money, depending on the consumption of living human labor, keeps the golden age in the bottle. Keeps that golden age in the bottle. People tend to know somehow about this contradiction. What needs to happen to transform vague awareness into determinate action that would end the nightmare? Postone does not try to formulate any particular answer to this decisive question, but he has a contribution to make that I will explore in the third and final section of the present essay. Pivotal to Postone's approach to bourgeois subjectivity and bourgeois subjectivity's drive to totalization is his thesis that, quote, dealing with commodities on an everyday level, involves, a continuous act of abstraction, end quote. This continuous everyday practice is the basis of the totalizing dynamic of modern bourgeois society. Conversely, this seems to imply that failure to deal with commodities such as one's labor power on a daily basis must result in crisis and disintegration of bourgeois subjectivity. Yeah. Just a side note, that Postone quote seems definitely relevant to like Joan Ratel's concept of real abstraction, right? The dealing with commodities on an everyday level involves a continuous act of abstraction. It's not like a necessarily an explicitly conceived abstraction, but it's kind of like a tacit presupposition of human beings engaged in that overall process. At least it's what it seems to me. Footnote. This is a footnote in relation to the sentence that said, conversely, this seems to imply that failure to deal with commodities such as one's labor power on a daily basis must result in crisis and disintegration of bourgeois subjectivity. And the footnote says, this is of course true only on a societal level. On the individual level, the opposite may be true. End footnote. A dynamic drive towards totalization is, however, is a unique and extraordinary fact. In an earlier text co-authored with Helmut Reinecke, Postone wrote, quote, only capitalism, not the history of humanity, reveals a totalizing logic, end quote. Although the logic of modern history is a, quote, progressively less random, end quote, one, the essence of the totality that constitutes itself in this process is contradictory, and thus implies its own negation as a possibility. Quote, excuse me, I keep burping. It is because this present is logically determined as a totality of contradictory essence that it logically points beyond itself to the possibility of a future form whose realization depends upon class struggle. The choice becomes socialism or barbarism, and this depends upon revolutionary practice, ... The historical determination of the dialectic points to a notion of history as the movement from contingency to a necessity, which, in its increasing self-contradictions, allows for the possibility of freedom, end quote. End quote. That's from Postone and Reinecke. It is interesting to see that Postone and Reinecke seem to equate here the concepts of, quote, class struggle and, quote, revolutionary practice, which implies that in this earlier text, quote, class struggle does not generically refer to the daily negotiating processes imminent in the unfolding of capital, that it refers to in time, labor, and social domination. The term refers here much more narrowly to those imminent moments by which the totality's dynamic could be superseded. The element of freedom and choice that, quote, revolutionary practice refers to is directed against the totalizing tendency whose product that, quote, revolutionary practice is. With necessity and domination, the contradictions grow. The possibility of freedom, that is, the negation of the totality, grows too. Nothing here, however, seems to imply that, quote, class struggle, in the sense of, quote, revolutionary practice, is most likely to come especially or even exclusively from members of the industrial working class. In Postone's understanding of Marx, quote, the character of modern universality and equality, end quote, are, quote, constituted with developments and the development and consolidation of the commodity-determined form of social relations, end quote. In particular, wage labor. There arise, quote, concomitantly, end quote, these arise, quote, concomitantly. Universalizing and equalizing practice is the root of the philosophical, political, social ideas of universality and equality. Just as these practices are ever historically specific, so are the concomitant ideas. The specific form of equality, as equality arises in the context of the capitalist mode of production, is based on the opposition of the universal and the particular. The universal is an abstraction from the particular. Marx's critique is directed neither against the one nor the other, but against their opposition, and, quote, points to the possibility of another form of universalism, one not based upon an abstraction from all concrete specificity, end quote. As with so many other concepts in the modern world, time leads the double life already familiar from the commodity, as concrete time and abstract time. Concrete time is time that is a dependent function of events such as natural or human periodicities, or particular tasks or processes such as cooking rice or saying a paternoster. What the fuck is a paternoster? Where am I here? Gotta find the lamp. I'm sitting here in the dark. Lord's Prayer, paternoster. Lord's Prayer. Didn't know that. Concrete time can be determined qualitatively. Concrete time can be good time or bad time, sacred or profane, and so on. Quote, the events do not occur within time, but structure and determine time. End quote. Postone. The modes of reckoning associated with concrete time allow for temporal units that vary. The measure of concrete time is thereby related to what sort of time that measure of concrete time refers to. The event that structures the time structures the measurement of time too. Abstract time is classically described in Newton's Principia as, quote, absolute, true, and mathematical time, which flows equally without relation to anything external, end quote. The dichotomy developed historically together with the two opposed forms of time discipline that competed in Europe for predominance from the late medieval period onwards, a traditional one based on a conception of concrete time versus a modern conception. The dichotomy developed historically together with two opposed forms of time, discipline, that competed in Europe for predominance from the late medieval period onwards, a traditional one based on a conception of concrete time versus a modern one based on abstract time. Time discipline based on concrete time referred to, quote, series of time points which marked when various activities were to be done, end quote. This sort of discipline can be found, for example, in a monastery, but had been fundamental to everyday life both in rural and urban Europe up until then. Discipline based on abstract time, in contrast, measures the duration of the activity itself. I have an essay on here that's like about time and labor in rural England from 1500 to 1700, which, according to other people as well, but the political Marxists in particular, as the time of agrarian capitalism, when, especially in England, or maybe only in England, more and more of society was becoming increasingly commodified with the development of a home market and a population of doubly free wage laborers who owned neither property land nor capital, and had only one thing to sell, which was their labor power. And it would probably be interesting to because a lot of times when you hear, this is just me personally, and this is probably, I don't know how, I can't assume your knowledge level or experience level with any of these kinds of concepts. I find it difficult to think about some of these things. I can't really, grasp an instance of it sometimes. And I think that probably reading that essay about the relationship to time and its change over a period. Because, of course, it's kind of the crux of Postone's argument is that it seems to me, is that value, which is a relationship between commodities, and the very fact of those labor products being commodities is conditioned by the existence of the law of value. I don't know if that came out right, but whatever. Is that, and since what dictates value is socially necessary labor time, and there's this constant pressure to reduce necessary labor time, and is that it fundamentally changes how human beings in conditions of modernity interact with time, and thus the experience of time, and so on and so forth. And I think maybe digging a little deeper into, like, particular instances of how temporality was experienced, such as in what's his name? E.P. Thompson's, like, something blah blah blah, and work discipline and something like that. I've never actually read that myself, much to my chagrin, because you see it fucking everywhere. But yeah, getting a little more into, like, maybe like the history of time could make things a little more I don't know, seem less in the clouds. Even though, obviously, when you're talking about something at this level of abstraction, like modernity and time in modernity, you're talking in very abstract levels, and are making generalizations. It might be helpful to, like, kind of like see, know something about the history of time, the social history of time, not like the natural history of time. Anyway, should read that, shouldn't I? Postone distinguishes two dimensions of a transformation of the social reality of time. Until the 14th century, or 1300s, the urban workday was defined in variable hours, just as the rural was. At that time, quote, relatively large-scale, privately controlled production for exchange, that is, for profit, based on wage labor, end quote, developed in those European towns where cloth was produced, one of the first mass export products. This new mode of production presupposed and reinforced the monetarization of some sectors of medieval society, and caused also the concept of productivity to become a central category of production. The fact that workers in these places were paid by the day generated a class struggle over the length of the working day. The working day ceased to be understood, quote, naively, from sunrise to sunset as the, quote, natural day. The disconnect of the working day from the natural day opened the gates to a redefinition of the concept of time as such. It implied that time could be understood as independent from seasonal variations, as constant and homogeneous time. Some people would argue, and this is one of the things that, this is just a comment, isn't it? This really stake a claim one way or the other. But other people would argue that this kind of, like, subsumption of traditional labor processes to new imperatives dictated by the market, and thus to commodity production and competition within commodity production and circulation, created new time imperatives. The first place that this would really have begun for people, say, like, to my understanding, I might be talking my ass with people like Ellen Mason's Wood and Robert Brenner, this would really begin in agriculture, not in the cities. In fact, a lot of those people, the reduction of the socially necessary labor time that goes into the basic consumption staple of the working class historically, of food, the reduction of price in food to something that people could at least hypothetically afford. Large numbers of poor people could have access to. There's a certain degree to which the same processes that caused labor to shed from the countryside and thus flow into the cities, also made food available for those new populations in the cities. Obviously, not everyone was quite as successful, and it was necessary for the Elizabethan poor laws to step in and, provide, lots of subsistence, usually to the crippled and maimed, and not to the so-called vagabonds, which were typically young men and women who were deemed able-bodied and blah, 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 blah. But really getting a capitalist economy off the ground to some extent depends upon there being some kind of access to cheap food, and the people who were most effective, the place where that was most effectively achieved was in Britain, because they already had agricultural, large sections of its agriculture were already market dependent, and thus were forced to try to reduce socially necessary labor time to a minimum in order to hopefully achieve the standard rate of profit and ideally surplus profits on the sale of their commodities. Anyway, so yeah, there's an idea. That's basically just to say that some people would dispute this kind of like idea of like the genesis of this orientation to time being something that emerged from the so-called interstices of the feudal order, and would place more emphasis on capitalist social relations in the countryside. Anyway, the transition from concrete to abstract time, however, depended on a second aspect of the overall social transformation underway. The struggle over the length of the working day and even the introduction of constant time would not of themselves replace discipline based on the concept of time as a series of time points, indicating when work started and when work stopped, with a discipline based on time as the measurement of work itself. The real difference between capitalist manufacture and a, quote, in the parenthesis, non-capitalist, end parenthesis, monastery, is that in capitalist manufacture, wealth is produced in the form of value. And as a side note, just for my own interest, this is going to be determined whether the USSR was a form of state capitalism or not, is whether this surplus, this exploited surplus that was no doubt there, took the form of value or not. Competition between capitalists, the capitalist compulsion to produce according to the latest standard of productivity, gradually subsumes the working process itself and turn the temporal measurement of activity into a compelling norm. Only when productivity became the decisive category of organizing production was activity measured in abstract time. Yeah, and this is another thing that like the political Marxists would say, is like, this happens in agriculture, and this is precisely what the so-called agrarian revolution would constitute, the idea of the increased productivity of agriculture based upon the application of technology, new technologies to it, and new production regimes to it, under the imperatives that were externally imposed upon that process. Even though that process is subsumed within that overall total social formation, the external market imperatives would cause them to seek to undermine existing, or compete, or maintain, and ideally undermine existing time norms in terms of how long it took to produce a commodity. So that's what they would say. This compulsion, this market compulsion, really begins in the countryside. Simultaneously, the concrete activity that takes place between, quote, time point X and, quote, time point Y turns into a mere appearance of an invisible essence, abstract labor of the quantity that corresponds to the duration of Y X hours to X hours. Only this context renders the concept of abstract time socially meaningful. When Newton formulated the concept of mathematical time in 1687, it was already a social practice. Equal and divisible time, abstracted from the sensuous reality of daylight, darkness, seasons, and so forth, and value expressed in the form of money, abstracted from the sensuous reality of goods, which have been the two decisive, quote, moments in the growing abstraction and quantification of ... everyday life, end quote. It'll be very interesting to see how that concept of the relationship between natural cycles and like abstract capitalist cycles dictate agriculture in terms of like how it relates to like sunrise and sunset, because historically that's been kind of like a dictator of like the agricultural working day, depending on what season you're in. I've been under the impression, and maybe this is a wrong impression because I'm not a scholar in peasant studies, but it seems to me that if you take, for example, places like Russia, where they have long and heavy winters, within the year, how time was regarded in the Russian countryside over the course of the year was different, right? So not only and a pretty extreme difference, right? I'm pretty sure that like in like the months where agriculture could be engaged in most forcefully, like this, or like sowing and harvesting, people worked all day, and I think in the winter time there was like almost like ridiculous amounts of free time. But like I said, I'm not sure. That was just an impression I picked up, and I don't know where from. Equal and divisible time, abstracted from the sensuous reality of daylight, darkness, seasons, and so forth, and value expressed in the form of money, abstracted from the sensuous reality of goods, have been the two decisive, quote, moments in the growing abstraction and quantification of ... everyday life, end quote, Postone. The most interesting point made by Postone is not, however, the mere distinction between concrete and abstract time, but his conception of concrete and abstract time's dialectic, quote, not every hour is an hour, end quote. Productivity, which is an attribute of the use value of the labor power, the use value of labor power, constitutes the, quote, social labor hour. That is, the qualitative standard of what can count as a, quote, real, socially valid hour of labor. This means, quote, the abstract temporal constant which determines value is itself determined by the use value dimension, end quote. Postone. Because what is being produced in a time unit under the new standard of productivity yields the same value as what had been previously produced in that time unit under the old level. Production must take over the new standard in order to remain competitive. 1 hour of labor yields that hour of labor's abstract value only when the process that happens concretely in that hour is performed in the latest state-of-the-art manner. The value side determines, quote, subsumes, end quote, the concrete side, in turn because the abstract depends on the concrete. To give that an example, a funny example, like if you tried, if someone hired you to cut a lawn, and this actually happened to my friend one time. He tried to like cut a lawn or like trim some hedges or something. He was not my friend anymore, but he tried to like trim some hedges or shits for some guy. He agreed to do like a job for a guy. And and by the hour, it was paid by the hour, and it was like cutting grass or like some kind of like something that required some type of equipment, right? So like a lawnmower or like a chainsaw or something like that. And he agreed to work by the hour, and he showed up to started working, and he was using like some kind of like, because he didn't have a chainsaw at the time, or like it was in the shop or something, and he started like working um uh with this like really primitive form of technology by the hour. And it's and the guy was like freaked out. I was like, what the fuck are you doing, dude? I'm not paying you by the hour to like cut my grass with a pair of scissors or something. It's something like that. And or like something like real crude. And being the whole thing or whatever. But just for that example, right, is that the very fact that the imperatives of value over time, or maybe not even over time, fundamentally dictate what must happen, what concretely must happen in individual production processes for the individual capital, for those processes to remain viable capitalistically, which is oftentimes at all. So, for instance, if you're trying to run a bakery or something like, well, no, if you're trying to run some factory and you're using primitive ass, expensive technology where the labor that you have to pay for, you're paying an hourly wage to somebody, and they have to, work even longer in order to produce goods that should take half the time. Uh, you're paying for things that you, by the standards of competition, by the standards established by competition, shouldn't be paying for, and thus you are like. And then when you go to sell that commodity, you have to compete with people whose labor process was far less expensive, and thus you fail to make a sufficiently large gap between the money you put into the production process and what you got out of it if you're a capitalist. So yeah, it's kind of the idea that like, the imperatives of the value form dictate what happens concretely at the production site. It's not like and they kind of, and this is kind of like the dialectic is that, if what concretely, if someone concretely develops their particular technological setup in such a way that they're allowed to get super profits because they're putting so much less money into the monetary inputs into the production process than everybody else. They're they're getting they're getting super profits, and and other people obviously are also, other capitals are looking to make super profits. They're going to adopt that same type of technology, ideally if they can. And when that becomes when that concrete technology becomes universalized, when more and more it becomes the standard as opposed to like an outlier, it fundamentally changes um, the amount of value that a particular unit of that said commodity holds, right? So there's a balance, there's like not a balance, but there's a dialectic, there's a push and pull between production, the concrete factors of production, and the valorization factors of production. And uh, the concrete, you know, the concrete aspect, which I think is which becomes generalized through the generalization of production technique amongst different production sites operating within the same branch of industry. That fundamentally changes value, and at the same time, value presses down on those same producers to tighten production further, make it cheaper, which correlates to incorporating less time into the production process. Both less time in the. Sorry, I'm confusing myself. I'm probably just confusing other people. Anyway, 1 hour of labor yields that hour of labor's abstract value Only when the process that happens concretely in that hour is performed in the latest state-of-the-art manner. The value side determines, quote, subsumes the concrete side, in turn because the abstract depends on the concrete. Postone uses the expression, quote, treadmill effect to designate the dynamic interaction of the duality of abstract labor / value / abstract time and concrete labor / wealth / concrete time. The whole constellation moves on while it nonetheless stands still. An increase in productivity makes the social labor hour more, quote, dense in terms of the production of goods. This determination, quote, density, is an aspect of concrete temporality. The development of productivity does not change the abstract temporal unit. An hour always has 60 minutes. But the development of productivity moves the abstract temporal unit, quote, forward in time. 1 hour of labor time today is in the abstract 1 hour of labor time 5 years ago. But the hour of labor time today and the hour of labor time 5 years ago are two different hours in terms of what is happening qualitatively. The more productive and dense the labor time is, the worse for the laborer. Quote, density corresponds to the related concept of the rate of exploitation. Postone describes thus, quote, a dialectic of two forms of time, end quote, that is related to the dialectic of abstract and concrete labor, an ongoing directional movement of time, a, quote, flow of history. Historical time emerges together with abstract time. Time is abstract temporal norm, concomitantly with the development of the commodity as a totalizing social form. The abstract norm, quote, 1 hour, is static, despite the flow of historical time, just as the amount of value yielded in that abstract hour is static despite the progress of productivity. Abstract time, although static in itself, moves within historical time. From the perspective of the present, however, history flows invisibly behind abstract present time. Postone arrives here at a theory of time and the historical dynamic of modern bourgeois society that in turn has the concepts of time and history at its core. The capitalist mode of production is characterized by the dualism of normative, abstract, and directional historical time, the latter being the directional and historical time being a historically specific form of concrete time that expresses an ongoing dynamic transformation at a pace that may accelerate or slow down at times. On the conceptual level, this is the crowning achievement of Postone's book. From here, Postone is able to point towards an understanding of contemporary social movements that I suggest goes far beyond the terms of much debate today. I will address these and add some considerations that I think could be derived from Postone's work on the concluding pages. Before, I would like to examine two objections that have been made by critics which, by way of contrast, can make the distinctiveness of Postone's contribution a little clearer. It's the end of the section, but there's a footnote here that I missed. Footnote. Its value may be decreased, however, if the value of food and all the things that are necessary or that are considered necessary to reproduce labor power has shrunk. End footnote. Readings of Postone. Universal Subjects and Eternal Structures. In this section, I will explore two reviews of Postone's book from opposite poles of the spectrum by Chris Arthur and Martin J. Arthur has a lot of praise for the theoretical structure of Postone's main argument, which Arthur understands as redressing previous mistaken assumptions about Marx's relation to Hegel. Arthur agrees with Postone that Marx turned observations made by Hegel into historically specific concepts and discovered Hegel's, quote, rational kernel, ironically, in Hegel's idealism. Arthur further agrees that, quote, value is not merely a regulator of circulation nor a category of class exploitation alone. Rather, it shapes the form of the production process and grounds the intrinsic dynamic of capitalist society, end quote. Chris Arthur. If you don't know, I have pieces by Chris Arthur on the page. Chris Arthur claims, however, that Postone, quote, loses sight of the, quote, dialectical interchange between structure and struggle, end quote. Intrinsic to this, Arthur's formulation is telling here, quote, Arthur's fatal mistake is to go from, quote, capital cannot be grasped fully in terms of class alone, end quote, from this, quote, fully and this, quote, alone to a complete rejection of the significance of class struggle for socialism, end quote. Chris Arthur. Chris Arthur argues here that two statements do not follow from each other, that are actually two different statements on different issues and seem not meant to follow from each other in the first place. The significance or non-significance of class struggle for socialism is not the same question as the significance or non-significance of the class struggle for capitalist society. What Postone actually states is that class struggle constitutes the history of capitalist society. This is not a statement about, quote, socialism and how to get there. Postone acknowledges the dialectic of structure and struggle, but while he agrees that the way out must be found within the actuality of society, it cannot be identical with its main mode of movement. The main bone of contention in Arthur's critique of Postone is the concept of, quote, standpoint of labor. Postone stresses that Marx's is a critique of labor, not a critique of exploitation from the, quote, standpoint of labor. Arthur answers that a critique of labor can indeed be formulated from the standpoint of labor and claims that this is what Marx intended. Postone's claim, approved by Arthur, that the working class is integral to capitalism and not, quote, the embodiment of capitalism's negation, end quote, is an ontological statement. Without a working class, no value, no capital. Arthur's claim that the working class, from its, quote, standpoint, can formulate a critique of labor is an epistemological statement. Although being intrinsic to capital, the working class is able to formulate and realize a critique. Arthur seems to assume that the first statement logically excludes the second one. Quote, Postone, cannot see how within the system one can posit its objective transcendence. Thus, Postone cannot grasp the standpoint of labor as giving rise to a self-transcending movement, end quote. Arthur tries to turn here the main postulates of Frankfurt School critical theory developed by Postone abundantly in the first part of his book against Postone. The defining hallmark of critical theory being immanent critique based on intrinsic contradictions of the society that constitutes that critique's object. Arthur rejects Postone's argument that, quote, overcoming capital cannot be based on the self-assertion of the working class, end quote. Quote, of course it can. If workers assert themselves as the human beings they are in addition to bearers of labor power. Postone speaks as if capital has successfully reified the capital relation, as if workers could not possibly think in and against the value form, end quote. The problem here is precisely defining what, quote, self-assertion and, quote, in addition means. Workers are, of course, not only, quote, bearers of labor power, but also fundamentally not, quote, in addition, quote, human beings. What, however, is the, quote, self they are supposed to assert? What Arthur suggests is their, quote, self-assertion would better be described as the self-sublation, bracket, Selbstaufhebung. Or maybe it's Aufhebung. No, Aufhebung. That's probably how I say it. Selbstaufhebung, or self-abolition of the working class, that is, the self-remaking of human beings, that in the process stop being workers and become human beings in a fuller, more emphatic, novel sense of the word. This is the conception implicit in Postone's understanding of critical theory, and advocate of Adorno's concept of, quote, non-identity. This is the conception implicit Sorry, I'm fucking spacing out here. What Arthur suggests is their, quote, self-assertion would better be described as the self-sublation or self-abolition of the working class, that is, the self-remaking of human beings, that in the process stop being workers and become human beings in a fuller, more emphatic, novel sense of the word. This is the conception implicit in Postone's understanding of critical theory and evocative of Adorno's concept of, quote, non-identity in negative dialectics. Arthur claims that, quote, Postone cannot locate his critique socially. Postone can only retreat to, quote, possibilities that might or might not be grasped, quote, subjectively, end quote. It would be more adequate to say that Postone cannot locate his critique sociologically. Postone locates his critique socially, namely in the specific structures of capitalist society. It is true, however, that Postone does not name the revolutionary subject that can be trusted to carry out this critique in praxis. However, this weakness might prove to be, in reality, a strength because it leaves it to the spontaneity of the historical process to show who is going to carry the torch. Quote, how feeble, end quote, exclaims Arthur. What Arthur has to say about the working class, though, is not so strong, either. If the revolutionary potential of the working class merely consists in, quote, asserting their humanity, which they possess, quote, in addition to being workers, one might want to ask, what is so special about that? Is this not just another formulation of the humanism of which Arthur accuses Postone? Would not all people, quote, assert, better discover or develop their, quote, humanity in a revolutionary process? While on many points Arthur seems to be very close to Postone's position, the one point where Arthur actually differs, Arthur's notion of the proletariat as the revolutionary subject, is not convincing. Arthur's conclusion that Postone is a, quote, shamefaced revisionist, end quote, sounds like the work of projection. Shifting the responsibility for making the revolution onto any particular group of people implies the kind of theoretical closure that is the characteristic of revisionism. I tend to a slightly different belief in this matter, the quite plausible assumption that a revolution can only successfully be made if that revolution rests on the general participation of value producers, that is, not in a constellation where a functioning coalition of value producers and value appropriators are opposed only by non-productive groups or categories of people, is a difficulty. It puts the contribution that other social groups can make into perspective. It does not, though, exclude the other social groups from potentially, quote, making the revolution, let alone from understanding its necessity and its aims. Martin J. bypassed the otherwise obligatory discussion of how Postone's conception relates to the Marxist tradition, and asked whether or not it was adequate to, quote, to contemporary society. J. states that transcendence of the, quote, capitalist order will be marked by, quote, the end of all, abstractly universal meta-subjects, end quote. Instances such as the Weltgeist, described by Hegel as transhistorical entities, were shown by Marx to be categories specific to capitalist society. Jay states that the transcendence of the, quote, capitalist order will be marked by, quote, the end of all, abstractly universal meta-subjects, end quote. Instances such as the Weltgeist described by Hegel as trans-historical entities were shown by Marx to be categories specific to capitalist society, and it must be deduced that no such categories have any legitimacy beyond capital. The, quote, universal subject is a category of capital, not one of revolution. Jay grasped accurately the principal concern of Postone's book, the basic contradiction between wealth and value. The developed contradiction intrinsic to the commodity form has not been resolved, on the contrary, immensely increased, and this fact provides the ground for resisting the pessimistic conclusion of those who only see a, quote, one-dimensional administered world replicating itself ad infinitum. Quote, an imminent critique of capitalism's dialectical contradictions, and not a critique that merely pits ideals against those ideals' betrayal in reality, is thus, despite everything, still possible, end quote. The capitalist mode of production is rendered anachronistic by the imminent dynamic of capitalist society, and along with value, proletarian labor itself becomes anachronistic. While labor continues to constitute value, and labor will continue to constitute value by definition as long as there is a capitalist mode of production, the production of wealth objectively necessitates so little working activity now that the latter does potentially not have to take the social form of proletarian capitalist labor. This argument, central to Postone's conception, implies that working activity could now take another, possibly a communist social form in the course of the abolition of the capitalist mode of production. This is the core of what is, despite first impressions, as optimistic a social theory as one could currently hope to find. It is perhaps somewhat ironic that it fell to a noted practitioner of, quote, history of ideas to point out that, quote, it is irrelevant whether or not Postone's Marx is the, quote, real one, end quote, or not. Although the question of a consistent reading of Marx is, quote, not a trivial issue, end quote, the, quote, more pressing question, however, is whether or not Postone's version of Marx's ideas can survive on their own merit, end quote. Just a side note, I'm thinking about it now. I believe Martin Jays might have a blurb about the book on the back of Time, Labor, and Social Domination. The answers that Jay gives to this question are particularly interesting because they are given not from a Marxist perspective, but from an rather idealist perspective. Jay's rejection of some of Postone's crucial postulates illuminate against Jay that the general strength of Postone's argument lie in its Marxian character. Jay points out that Postone's portrayal of modern bourgeois society hinges, quote, on the theme of dominating abstraction, end quote, emanating from the, quote, dual abstraction of temporality and labor, end quote. Jay relates that Postone took up the claim made by Alfred Sohn-Rethel, who described the relationship between philosophy and, quote, abstract thinking, and the invention of money and the commodity in ancient Greece. Crucially, Postone's take on Sohn-Rethel's thesis is the historical specification that, quote, only with modern capitalism does the domination of abstraction become genuinely total, end quote. This decisive claim is based on Marx's distinction between overt and socially mediated, apparently natural and non-societal domination, the latter being characteristic of modern bourgeois society, a social universe of, quote, personal independence in a context of objective dependence, end quote. Jay challenges this point that is without doubt central to Marx as well as to any form of Marxism, including Postone's. Jay claims that the difference between the importance of abstraction for ancient Greece and for modern capitalist society is, quote, only a difference of degree, not in kind. There are, moreover, other sources of abstraction which may also dominate the human subjects to them, end quote. Jay names monotheism as an example. Quote, a God who is indivisible, invisible, and transcendent is certainly a powerful example of the human tendency to abstract, a tendency which cannot be derived from capitalist relations of production, end quote. Jay argues that this point as if monotheism could only have been caused either by, quote, capitalist relations of production or otherwise by, quote, the human tendency to abstract. Actually, George Thomson, on whose research Zoenrato had partly based his argument, did address the emergence of monotheism from a historical materialist point of view, as did others before and after George Thomson. Classical Mediterranean culture did not have to wait for capitalism to develop philosophy, monotheism, and other abstractions, but this does not mean they are human universals. Most importantly, it would be daring to argue that any one of these abstractions in antiquity determined the everyday lives of all members of society, if one can talk of a, quote, society, in a way only remotely as totalizing as capitalist society's domination by value. As a second example, Jay argues that language, which, quote, necessarily employs abstract signifiers to signify an infinity of different phenomena, end quote, has a, quote, inevitably abstracting function, end quote, a, quote, always already existing system no one has consciously constructed, end quote, cannot be derived from capitalism either. True enough, nobody ever claimed, though, that any kind of abstraction is due to the capitalist mode of production, and certainly not Postone. The point is that only in capitalism do abstract social forms become determining, totalizing moments. Abstraction may well be found in any form of social constellation or human intercourse, but the question is what their social content and their social function are. Jay's objections can be refuted with reference to a distinction made in Marx in Grundrisse and taken up by Postone, the distinction between necessary necessities and non-necessary. Historically specific necessities, that is, necessities only imminent to the capitalist mode of production. The context of this distinction is Marx's implicit admission that even in communism, not all activity will be pure play. Some things that are not play just have to be done, from scrubbing the toilets to heart transplants. The point is that the amount of such necessary, unavoidable necessities is small compared to the non-necessary capitalist necessities, and could not serve as the social basis of a totalizing mediation in the way abstract labor does. A lot of work could be done in pointing out in detail the evolution of the elements of what Postone calls the, quote, reconstruction of Marx's critical theory. Obviously, this is not something that has been invented or started by Postone. His is a work of analysis and synthesis. A rich trajectory would have to be unearthed and systematized in order to flesh out a renewed project of Marxian critical theory. The critical exegesis of Marx's own writings is but the necessary starting point. Postone's admittedly sweeping category of, quote, traditional Marxism must not be rejected flatly, but answered with detailed presentations of what it fails to cover and acknowledge. I would appreciate, however, that such work of recovery will not invalidate, however, that such work of recovery will not invalidate, but support Postone's general argument. Let me just read these. There's a couple of footnotes at the end. In Postone 1997, Postone discusses in condensed form a large number of references. A friendly mark by Postone typically points out the specific merits of a contribution, for example, Harry Braverman's, and suggests that his own general conception accommodates critical contributions better than, quote, traditional Marxism does. End of that footnote. Second footnote. In this context, it might be useful to know that Time, Labor, and Social Domination was written, although not completed, in the period from the mid-1970s to the mid-1980s, when Postone lived and studied in Frankfurt. A properly contextualized interpretation of the book would have to explore how it relates to the conflicts and social practices of that period. Very broadly, I suggest that Postone's position developed as a form of defending the essence of Frankfurt School critical theory against Frankfurt School critical theory's decline into, on the one hand, Habermas post-liberalism, and on the other, the re-Leninization of the extra-parliamentary and student movements. That seems fucking apt. Good work, Stoetzler. Reconstructing a movement of a new type. Although the form of Postone's discourse is that of a polemic, in its essence it is not a mere contribution to a, quote, intellectual history of how to read Marx. The book's implicit aim is much bolder. It could help redirecting the focus of contemporary social movements towards challenging the social forms that are essential to modern bourgeois society. The reception of the book has been largely marred by disputes about who said what first and who said it best, the daily bread of academics, quote, committed or not, who, by threat of starvation, are forced to stake out and guard their territories. Should, though, the argument of time, labor, and social domination somehow trickle through into the wider field of social movements, it could become an important contribution to a most necessary self-reflection and reconceptualization. It could contribute to a comeback of critical theory and a serious challenge to the limitations of, quote, social postmodernism and similar derivatives of philosophical and sociological phenomenology. Given the immense level of productivity either possible or realized at the beginning of our century, the production of material wealth is much more an objectification of collective human knowledge accumulated in historical time, an objectification of historical time and past labor than an objectification of present labor and present time. Value, however, remains an expression of immediate labor time. The fetishistic society of capital, mad enough to continue to produce its wealth in the form of value, is therefore increasingly rendered anachronistic by its own historical dynamic. With the accumulation of historical experience, the expenditure of immediate labor becomes less and less necessary. The dead assemble their accumulated strengths materialized in social knowledge in the widest sense to work for the benefit of the living. Quote, man, bracket, has, end bracket, succeeded in making the product of his past labor, ... perform gratuitous service on a large scale like a force of nature, end quote. Marx. However, the living work hard to remain in their zombie state of society. The necessity of labor is actually not being negated, but on the contrary is constantly reinforced. The present appears ever more an eternal present. The more the dynamics of historical time gains momentum. The more it moves in time, the more static the present becomes, because the capitalist dynamic depends on the continuous reconstruction of value production. The capitalist dynamic has to reconstitute a static, identical present continuously, while the possible dynamic of a non-capitalist, post-capitalist society would not. The twofold character of time in the capitalist mode of production implies a twofold compulsion. People not only have to always perform the same, they are always compelled to, quote, keep up with the times. We are compelled to do the ever same in the ever most recent as the only valid manner. Whilst all that is solid may melt into air then Postone's analysis of Marx's categories shows that the reverse is true. 2. All that is fluid is frozen in stone. The production of value destroys not only humans and human society, but also the non-human environment. Postone stresses that the destruction of nature is, quote, not simply a function of nature having become an object for humanity. Rather, it is primarily a result of the sort of object that nature has become, end quote, which is a historically specific sort of object. Because the runaway character of productivity is intrinsic to the capitalist mode of production, imminent attempts to restrain production in order to stop nature's obstruction are impossible, illusory, and antisocial because, quote, failure to expand surplus value would indeed result in several economic difficulties with great social costs, end quote. Postone. This implies that attempts to reform capitalist society not only fail to work, but can be expected to make things worse. In a society that has overcome capital, the general large-scale reduction in labor time and a qualitative change of labor would lead to a conception of work that would be both quantitatively and qualitatively different from labor in capitalist society, as well as different from pre-capitalist drudgery. Such a transformation would have to be based on the negation of the, quote, socially constituting role played by labor in capitalism, end quote, that is, of abstract labor, which would imply a, quote, fundamental restructuring and resignification of social life in general, end quote. It is indeed ironic that the passage through maximal exploitation, destruction, and alienation is created for humanity the chance to create itself as humane. This analysis provides the basis for a social critique that could overcome the double domination of fetishistic forms of social critique as either the, quote, primitivist, abstract negation of advanced technology as if it were per se alienating, or as the affirmative critique that intends to continue capital determined production under a, quote, socialist regime of, quote, just distribution. The latter can be understood as a radicalization, but also a continuation of the bourgeois revolutions from the 18th and 19th centuries that had based themselves on demanding that the wealth produced ought to be distributed and consumed by its producers, the third estate, alias la nation, not by the, quote, idle classes. The modern bourgeoisie that imagines that even Adam and Eve had nothing better to do than weaving and spinning has always given those who come under the suspicion of being, quote, unproductive a hard time. It is the essence of the concept of, quote, justice that those who do not sweat shall not eat. Differences and antagonisms notwithstanding, working class movements, women's and minorities movements, inasmuch as their struggles aim at, quote, equality and the universal validity of, quote, rights, have democratized and ipso facto helped to develop capitalist social forms. Inevitably, though, they developed reservations about equality and universality, as in liberty, equality, property, and Bentham, too, since universal rights depend on the simultaneous existence of difference and specificity, just as universal value depends on particular use value. These modern and social movements stopped at some point and re-emphasized differences and identities. When feminists regressed into celebrating, quote, femininity, or ethnic minorities put their hopes into chimerical categories such as, quote, indigenousness, they echoed a pattern first established when the revolutionary proletariat, once conceived as the class that is not a class, settled for, quote, being the working class. The universal class had to have discovered that its claim to universality could only be cashed in by being a particular and useful class, useful for value production. The trajectory from transcendence to identity, or from dialectics to positivity, is one trait that otherwise rather antagonistic movements have in common. Nevertheless, this intrinsic contradiction, basically that of the commodity form, meant that social movements also subverted themselves, although their main effects were in tune with capitalist modernization. They produced surplus effects that pointed beyond this and to a lesser extent still continue to do so, even in a state of regression and institutionalization. Everybody who is an owner and seller of commodities, that is a bourgeois subject, has a material and necessary interest, by punishment of starvation, to contribute to the reproduction of capital in all its dimensions. This includes those who have nothing to sell but their labor power. The development of consciousness and activity the development of consciousness and activity that would transcend the capitalist mode of production does not rise, quote, organically, from the state of being a mere seller of labor power. Being working class in the first instance renders one a member of bourgeois society, and bourgeois society's community of producers, not bourgeois society's enemy. The main thrust of working class struggles had, and to varying degrees still has, to aim towards, quote, liberty, equality, property, and Bentham, that is, towards being accepted as a full member of the existing society, not towards creating another one. Any expectation other than that is or was an idealistic delusion. Disappointed lovers of the working class, tired from Uberhelgen, the proletariat, cried their, quote, farewell, traveling the dark side of the road back towards liberalism. Nothing could have been less surprising. Once one has arrived within the club of the emancipated and naturalized, one can work towards changing the rules of the game, but it is just as possible and empirically more probable that the new arrivals will help to keep others out. See the history of, quote, yellow trade unions and, quote, white feminists. This fate is shared by all movements that are modeled on the idea of fighting for, quote, justice and equality. Equality such as in, quote, equal wage for equal work, justice, as in, quote, a fair wage for a fair day's work, end quote, the right to realize what, quote, one is worth, end quote, the undiminished value of one's labor power. Movements that fight for emancipation fight for being a full subject of and within bourgeois society. They are movements struggling for the realization of the principle of exchange of equivalents, that is, the totalization of the bourgeois mode of production, the, quote, real subsumption of society under it. Marx gave expression to this tendency in his ironic hymn to capitalist society, the Communist Manifesto. Footnote. I mean, quote, ironic in the strong sense of the word, such as in, quote, romantic or, quote, Hegelian irony. Postone differentiates three forms of, quote, critique and opposition in capitalism, end quote, which would perhaps better be described as three dimensions of social movements that hardly ever actually occur in, quote, ideal typical form. The defense of traditional social forms, or whatever people consider to be traditional social forms. The reference to the, quote, gap between the ideals of modern capitalist society, such as justice and equality, quote, and its reality, and the reference to, quote, the growing gap between the possibilities generated by capitalism and its actuality. Whereas the first form could be described as conservative, the second could be termed liberal. The third form, the movement of a new type, is the determined negation of the second. It would not appeal like the liberals to the supposedly good intentions of capital, but to its unintended effects. It would understand capital as the Mephistophelian, that's a reference to like the devil sort of character in Faust. At least that's my understanding. It's the devil. It's kind of like the trope of, like, to my understanding, I'm not a fucking literary expert and I've never read Faust, but to my understanding, like, Mephistopheles is like a character who's Faust is like a scientist or maybe like an alchemist, and Mephistopheles is like meets Faust to trade his soul, like the tip of like selling the soul to the devil and, like, I don't know, not getting what you want out of it is what I think the Mephistopheles references, but I'm not sure. It would understand capital as the Mephistophelian force that always intends evil but unintentionally produces good. What exactly needs to happen to make one oppose or even fight this society and its community is an infinitely difficult question to examine. The implication of Postone's book is that in contemporary developed capitalist society, it must have to do with the quotidian experience of the grotesque anachronism of being trapped within a society that is bound to the production of value as the only legitimate form of the production of wealth. Postone states that changing attitudes towards labor, the articulation of various social needs and forms of subjectivity should be interpreted in the framework of, quote, the increasingly anachronistic character of the structure of work and of other institutions of social reproduction and their continued centrality in modern society, end quote. This restates a pivotal argument of orthodox Marxism. The possibility of the emergence of forces that could overcome the mode of production is grounded in the mode of production's anachronism, that is, the fact that the mode of production obstructs society's further developing its potential. Postone stresses that in this context, some strands of the feminist movement have tried to, quote, formulate a new form of universalism beyond the opposition of homogeneous universality and particularity, end quote. This implication obviously does not answer the question, but it points to one direction where one might look. On one of the closing pages of the book, Postone suggests, quote, the theory of social mediation I outlined here might also be able to provide the basis for a fruitful reconceptualization of the social constitution and historical transformation of gender and race in capitalist society, end quote. Although this cannot be developed in the limited framework of the present essay, the direction of the discussion to be developed might have become evident. Taking seriously the basic categories of, quote, Marx's mature theory can provide the conceptual framework for the most adequate analysis of the various aspects of subjectivity and sociality in modern bourgeois society. Its historical dynamic and the imminent contradictions engendering movements and tendencies that could finally replace this society with another social formation, possibly a better social formation. Thanks for listening.